What's up, guys? I'm gonna go over chapter 13 notes here. This really covers just chapter 13, but lesson 2 and lesson 3, where we talk about the reform of slavery and women's rights movement. Okay, so here we go. So starting with abolition and reforming slavery. A growing number of Americans believe that slavery should end as soon as possible, instead of being abolished gradually over time. Though slavery was ending in northern states, many white Northerners still supported slavery and worried about the effect on free African Americans would have on society. So they weren't necessarily fans of slavery, but they supported it because they got what they wanted out of the deal. They may have not have owned slaves, but they still benefited from slave labor, getting things from the South that they needed in the North. And then they were worried they may mess up the way they lived if they were free. So they started this thing called the American Colonization Society. And they developed a plan to send free African Americans to Liberia in Africa. Only about 10,000 chose to resettle there, though. So their plan was to relocate all of these African Americans back to Africa, to Liberia, and hopefully, if they were free, they could go back. But the whole reason they came over here is because they were promised a better life, and so not a lot of them wanted to leave. So remember, by the end of slavery, there were almost 4 million enslaved people living in the United States, and so only 10,000 chose to relocate, leaving a lot of people still in the United States. So many whites and African Americans began writing books and publishing newspapers that publicly called for the end of slavery. Frederick Douglass, remember that name? We want to highlight that. Worked to abolish slavery, and Sojourner Truth, another name, highlight that, traveled the nation speaking against slavery and for women's rights. Both had been born as enslaved people. Abolitionists established the Underground Railroad to help enslaved people escape from the South. So remember, these are all things we've already talked about. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, big time names that you'll need to remember. Underground Railroad, obviously the big name that goes with that is Harriet Tubman. She was one of the big helpers helping people escape. And remember the map we looked at, where all of the Underground Railroads kind of started at the edge of the South and went out. A lot of them to Canada, some of them to Mexico. So the reaction to the abolitionists. So white Southerners required enslaved labor to maintain their way of life. If it weren't for enslaved people, there would not have been as much cotton production. They would not have had as big of plantations. They would have had to pay their workers more money, and they would not have been as profitable. Many white Northerners worried that freed African Americans would never blend into American society, and others feared the abolition of slavery could cause war between the North and the South. So again, a lot of people on the fence, a lot of people not wanting to jump to the other side because they don't know what it's like. A lot of people the fear of the unknown is kind of big in this spot right here, especially for the Northerners. Opposition to abolitionism sometimes led to violence, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, as we've seen here, even in the world right now. Protests sometimes lead to violence, and people being against what you say you believe in or whatever can lead to violence. So, and that's what happened here. So people wanting to keep slavery got upset. All right, so now moving on to women, the women's reform movement. So these names right here, these are 3 big ones to remember. Go ahead and highlight these: Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. They were the 3 key people in the women's rights movement. So they did a lot of things. We'll talk more about them as we get along. But the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was organized to discuss women's rights, and it was organized by these 3 ladies up here. A declaration of sentiments and resolutions was written that called for women's suffrage. So remember, suffrage is the right to vote. Seneca Falls Convention was a big step in the right direction for women's rights and women's suffrage. And these three ladies were a big part in that. Some supported equal pay and college training for women along with co-education. So they just wanted to be the same as the men. Okay, they wanted to be paid the same if they did the same work, or if they wanted to be able to go to the same colleges. So then they begin to attend college and become educated in subjects that were considered suitable only for men. Gains were made in marriage laws in some states that gave women the right to own property and to divorce their husbands and share guardianship of their children. So, before this, women were not allowed. Women weren't really allowed to do anything. They couldn't own property, and they couldn't even get a divorce unless the husband said so. Okay, so even if they were, in a bad situation or whatever, if the husband didn't agree to a divorce, they couldn't get one. So there are few jobs available for women in professions dominated by men, and that's, obviously men are not just going to get out of the way and give up their positions for women. It became competitive, which is good. Competition drives success. So the more people to work on things, somebody else to push you is always good. Right, and that's all for these notes. They're pretty quick. We hit everything fairly quickly just to make sure we've covered it. We've talked about a lot of these things in class already, so this is really just kind of a once over to make sure you guys got it. If you have any questions, let me know. But that's all for today.